Okay, so good afternoon and good morning and good night, depending on the time zones where you are. This is the third event we are organizing in a series of webinars called The Kindle in the Dark. Um, Another event promoted by Peripheries of Law, which is a research project led by Ghazal, Rashmi, Eirni, and I, all of whom are Sciences Po candidates, PhD candidates. This research project is meant to promote, as I was explaining earlier, a dialogue and the promote a dialogue, a legal dialogue from the perspective of the peripheries and semi-peripheries of the world. Today, we're going to be addressing the problem of precarization of working conditions and job insecurity. We have with us Professor Singh, who is a professor, um, and I'm going to try to pronounce again without making a mistake, at Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. And we have Professor Botha, who is a professor at Pretoria University, who will be sharing their insights and their points of view on this very pressing issue that only became more pressing in times of pandemic. Um, so I'll give the floor to Professor Botha first, who may start. Sorry. Oh, yeah, sorry, Professor Singh. True story. To Professor Singh, who will start addressing the topic. And you'll have more or less 20 minutes to present your views. Then we're gonna have Professor Botha speaking for more or less 20 minutes as well. And then we're gonna open the floor to the public, who is not just invited, is very much welcome to pose questions and participate in the discussion, because we would like to promote a very dynamic and conversational event. This is an opportunity for us to think together and share our thoughts on this very important issue. So, Professor Singh, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak in this forum. I thought when I read your email, you were sort of trying to whatever you're attempting to do with labor and law, and not necessarily in the metropolis, but little outside, everywhere, whatever. So yeah, I'm really I'm really happy to sort of thing. I will structure my whatever I want to say, a little bit oriented to work that I have done, and use that as a basis then for conversation to then to react and so on and so forth. Anyways, without qualifying too much, let me just begin. I want to really begin by looking at the discourse that's informed the relationship between labor law and economics over the past 20 or so years in India. In the early 2000s, a paper by Besley and Burgess got published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which said that Indian states that had tweaked the labor law into a pro-labor direction vis-a-vis states that had a more pro-employer direction as versus a more pro-labor orientation, performed better on both output and labor employment. Of course, this work has been critiqued by one of my colleagues, Aditya Bhattacharya, but you can imagine this kind of a critique has just not been accepted by the establishment. It's more or less ignored. And it's a really, it's a critique which goes into the methodology, into the econometrics of the exercises. All that's been, it's just been ignored. Instead, this rather than being sort of taken on, this discourse has been entertained actually variously by the Indian state. Initially in policy documents, and thereafter slowly but surely translated into sort of judicial and legislative changes. Firstly, it was the case that individual states, particularly those ruled by the right-wing Hindu nationalist BJP government, tweaked the law to reduce the coverage of the laws. However, all this came to a head more recently when the COVID crisis started. In the initial period when the pandemic actually came to light, the states that were ruled by the BJP actually suspended all the labor laws. And soon enough, the parliament, which is again, controlled by the Hindu nationalist BJP, transposed existing law into codes. These codes, this is a kind of an attempt, I think, by the Indian state now to take older colonial or what are acts like in the common law and then convert them into sort of civil law-like codes. I mean, I say that all with whatever some caveats. These codes, apart from few substantive changes, seem to characterized by endeavors to really reduce the coverage of laws. So, I don't, right now we can maybe do all this in the discussions and so on and so forth. We really don't have too much time to go into all the details. But, the modus operandi of these changes and or the nature of Indian labor law has always been to exclude this category, that category, so that, you fragment, if you like, the coverage of the laws. A very quick arbitrary example, because I just wanted to say something illustrative. The central government has proposed that to increase the maximum workday of factory workers by 1.5 hours in this new set of things. So now you will have a worker being allowed to work for 12 hours a day, as against the earlier limit of 10.5 that was with overtime and everything else. Now, these set of protracted reforms, of course, have the desire of going up in the ranks of the so-called ease of doing business, ostensibly to attract foreign investment into India. But I want to sort of, pause a moment to bring out something more, explicitly, the persistent ubiquity of this discourse. Again, I think there's a loss of time and so on and so forth. I just picked this up arbitrarily from the Guardian, the British newspaper, about 2 years ago. You had the World Bank writing in once again, saying that it's for less developing countries. You shouldn't be following the German Chancellor Otto Bismarck of the 19th century. Rather, you should be sort of having these laws which don't stymie enterprise, have lower minimum wages, have flexible dismissal procedures, etc. Now, the idea that permeates this genre of thinking, and this is really the first point that I want to make, is that labor laws inhibit employers from hiring workers because employers have to carry stocks of labor in the face of product market downturns, leading employers to constrain hiring and to increase capital labor ratios. The efficiency cost is further compounded because the restriction on the ability of firms to adjust and respond to exogenous changes harms all workers as a group, since long-run demand for labor diminishes. This kind of thinking is firmly based on the premises that the labor market is typically competitive, where wages reflect capacities of workers, and if market is allowed to function without impediments, it would result in the efficient allocation of resources, including labor. Admittedly, these outcomes may be inequitable, and in the absence of perfect insurance markets for labor, impose costs of unforeseen shocks on workers. The many laws and institutions pertaining to minimum wages, unions, termination, compensation, unemployment insurance, centralized bargaining, etc., come to be typically viewed as devices that compensate for these risks and inequities. If one works with conviction that the labor market is competitive, then such labor laws cannot but be a source of inefficiency. implying that we have to eternally confront an sort of escapable equity fairness trade-off. Equity efficiency or equity fairness efficiency trade-off, right? That will always accompany the legal intervention in the market. Now, there's no surprise that the reform of labor law has come to be associated with restricting coverage to a sequentially smaller fraction of the labor force. After all, it follows that if the coverage and content of labor law were expanded, it would be pernicious. While it may increase the welfare of some workers, it would lead to large economic efficiency loss. And also some of the what do you call Marxist analyses also, I mean, they don't quite follow this line of thinking, but they do have a similar trade-off kind of a thing, that capital and labor are supposed to be in antagonistic to each other. The gain of one is the loss of the other, and surely at the end of the day, the capitalist will put together devices to extract from labor. I mean, whatever, but that's the now. I think it's very important, in law, and when we're thinking about the relationship between law and economics and so on and so forth. I have been asked, because of this problem, right? I don't think it's really just an economic. It's not an efficiency equity trade-off alone. There may be elements of it, but we've got to somehow think out a newer kind of something here, which forces me down a particular route. And there is this economist, and these are people who are not, these are people who are not really widely bandied about. They don't show up too much. They published here and there in some journals, but they are at least not superstars, or their views don't come out that much. So I'm just sort of going to quickly take on one of them, a guy called McLeod, who has actually written the chapter of the institutions and so on and so forth, law and institutions, in the handbook of labor economics. And he's somebody who tells you that, actually labor law has been in place since, some version of it has been in place since antiquity. And this probably indicates the point that labor market institutions are some kind of a response to market failure. So it's not a question of having these perfectly competitive markets and so on and so forth. It's that there is some kind of a market failure that is taking place, and you've got to sort of go in there and understand what this market failure is. Now, since I work with manufacturing largely, or manufacturing in India, my empirical work has tried to engage with that. The problem that and the kind of set of ways in which when I've tried to look at this is really to sort of use the so-called incomplete contract literature, which is there in economics, which basically tells you that, and because I don't have the time, I realize I've miscalculated a bit of amount that one can get across. So this stuff basically tells you that the people are often making investment decisions, and one of the investment decisions is to invest in the job, in the skill on hand. Now, if you are going to be constantly vulnerable, now I'm really putting this very simply, then you are not going to invest in the skill, or the firm is not going to invest in you because you're going to maybe go away. So this kind of ex post what do you call, what they call quasi rent seeking, will mean that you need to kind of take care of this kind of investment by allowing the relationship to be a much longer term thing. And the law plays, I think, an extremely important role in that. And economists and other people who are working with economics and law, for example, I think I know in Cambridge University, the work of Simon Deacon and his students has really sat down and, I think, I can't pronounce her name very well, Noyoya, I think a few years ago, she wrote this wonderful book about how labor law, at least in common law imaginations, is obsessed with contract law, but it is also a version of property law where you're thinking about long-term investment in a job, which is very important. So in the Indian case, because of the way, and I guess I really will not have the time too much to go into this, the thinking doesn't go in this direction at all. Instead, the law had been tweaked to push this whole world of contract labor, which is there all over the world, but the Indian law the judiciary has consciously, we can talk about that later, has consciously actually increased this thing so that 35% of the manufacturing, what you call labor force, is contractual worker, that is, they work through a contractor who supplies it. So there is not a direct relationship between the principal employer and the worker. Yeah, the stuff that for the gig economy everybody is really, really upset about, and because of the lack of that relationship. So given all this, that India's huge contractual set of workers, when the pandemic hit, one of the biggest problems of this exodus out is because a number of workers simply had not invested in the place that they were in. Their work, their thing. In my own surveys before the pandemic, I had found that literally nobody, all these people who are in the manufacturing sector in India, even in the manufacturing sector, they're in very precarious living conditions, their housing and stuff like that. So anyway, so this is one set of things, and the latest codification of Indian law only pushes this further. The second thing that I want to quickly think, and I think I can finish that off. I think give me about 3 minutes. Is that all right? Yeah. I think what I want to flag, as they say, is really about in this same breath about technology. And there is this guy who should have got the Nobel Prize, but they gave it to some they gave it to guys who help capitalists make more money. Asimoglu has really got the thing about how much this is also in the contemporary times is also a problem of technology, of how much technology is now substituting, and the way work is organized is being set up to deprive workers of their whatever rights and so on and so forth. I'm not able to, because of the lack of time, I'm not able to develop this, but we can talk about it. But technology is then one of the central things that we want to raise here. The third thing that you put up there, that in the face of this kind of change, I mean, we are not going to continue being in this manufacturing world from the periphery from what is in the West, the periphery here. The manufacturing world is very important for India. It's very important because that is the way we imagine that some kind of employment and wealth will be generated out here. But simultaneously, and that's one thing about technology, it comes in simultaneously as well, right? So we are going to have a bit of a problem out there with the gig economy and so on and so forth. But as we seek solutions, there is this stuff about the universal income kind of a thing. Now, I think that's somewhere I think one bit of my own teaching and work. I don't know, it doesn't sound logical, but I'm forced to it because I teach a course in economics and ethics. So we read Gandhi sometimes. And if you read Gandhi, you can't help but think about his bread labor thing that he says the divine. And I'm quickly reading this out. Just a thing: the divine law that man must earn his bread by laboring with his own hands was first stressed by the Russian writer named T.M. Banderov. Tolstoy advertised it and gave it wider publicity. In my view, the same principle has been set forth in the third chapter of the Gita, and we are told that he who eats without offering sacrifice eats stolen food. Sacrifice here can only mean bread labor, and so on and so forth. So, you'll have the typical Gandhian sort of mixture of Hindu, whatever, this stuff, and mixing it up with Tolstoy and so on and so forth. And coming to this thing that there is something fundamentally important about work. So any kind of dystopia, utopia that we imagine, should have some bit of work there. Yeah, so that I hope we can have some further conversation on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Singh. That was very, very enlightening. We will give the floor to Professor Botha. Professor Botha, I'm not sure, we discussed that you may have a PowerPoint presentation. Is that the case?
Yes, I do. Let me just see if I can load it.
You should be able to use the share screen function at the bottom of your screen. I see that one of our attendees has brought to our attention that they cannot see Professor Botha. We are aware of this problem. It is unfortunate, but Professor Botha seems to be having a technical problem with his camera. Having said that, we're hoping that even though we cannot see his lovely, friendly face today, that we will be able to see his presentation. So let's hold thumbs and hope for the best.
An alternative is to send it to one of us that we can share.
Yes, this is what I was about to say.
That's an excellent idea. Professor Botha, would you like to share your PowerPoint with us, and we can then share it on the screen if you're struggling to do so? According to Professor Botha, this is happening because he updated his iOS system yesterday. So I would just like to bring to everyone's attention once again the inefficiencies of Apple.
Sorry, can I make a suggestion? I don't know. I'm just going to quickly just make I had the same problem. One of the things that, and I'm also working with an Apple. So one of the things is just to completely restart the machine, and then sometimes the camera catches on. Is this FaceTime kind of there's a kind of a tussle between FaceTime and other things.
Okay, I've sent you the PowerPoint presentation, but I can do that. I can restart the meeting too.
Once again, we must ask our attendees for their patience. Thank you very much for being with us today, and we hope you can wait for a couple of minutes till we get this sorted out.
Okay, I do have Professor Botha's presentation, but I think he's also just trying to restart his computer as well, as per Professor Singh's suggestion. Professor Singh, we thank you for coming to the rescue of Apple.
Oh dear. Always it delays things a bit also. But,
yes,
anyways.
yes, it's unfortunate. Perhaps if one of our panelists has any questions or comments in the meantime, we can address them with Professor Singh while we wait for Professor Botha to return.
Sure. I have a question.
Yeah.
Maybe because there are many interesting things that you touched upon, and you brushed through this idea of regulating the labor market through supply chains, or this move that is happening because now there's outsourcing happening. So most of manufacturing actually is taking place, or people working in manufacturing do not have relations with the ultimate, let's say, they're producing, let's suppose they're produced to Nike, but actually they're not in a labor relation with Nike. They have a certain intermediary in the middle, and this supply chain is actually regulated through contracts, and the relation with the local manufacturer is potentially even informal. So if you could come back at this and maybe explore a little bit more this issue, especially in the context of the Indian labor regulation, I think it would be very interesting.
Yeah. I have no idea how this is going to span out now, especially because of this the change that took place literally while the COVID was around, and the labor codes, the various labor codes. So we're still trying to grapple with this and find out what what's going to happen. But going back into the into the past, so typically, to the extent that you had these supply chains and so on and so forth, these would be, there would be some relationship, of course, between the unit that manufactured and the company located wherever else, in the US or in Europe or whatever. And it would then, do its own hiring and so on and so forth. And that's where the story comes in. So there would be a balance there between how many of those workers would be these, what I'm calling contract workers with lesser rights than other workers who had more, more better rights, if you like. Yeah. So you could ask the question, why wasn't everybody else made a contract worker? Why didn't that happen? So when you actually sit and you look into these kinds of things, there is a element of skill which is there, and then you find a lot of people complaining or saying that if you only worked with a contractual system, yes, it was cheap for you, cheap and cheaper or whatever than hiring in regular labor and paying those wages and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there was a kind of a way in which the worker may suddenly leave. The worker would not be adequately trained. So it was the most unskilled labor, which then really that caught on. And there were other instances where this would be a much bigger, much longer relationship. And I have actually got stories of, I had a student of mine, who did some very extensive field work. Maybe this is not exactly the supply chain setup. So I think there is a difference between things, but nevertheless, sometimes the frustrations when people were able to coalesce and come together, even the contract workers were taken on via a union on conditions or on terms that were very close to those of more permanent workers. So sitting inside, that's why I really feel very strongly that sitting inside these various kinds of relationships of skill and ability and so on and so forth, and productivity, with the very basis of so-called wealth generation and so on and so forth, there are organizational structures and which are really, because I think informally, I'm sure things develop, and I think that we've got very little research on, what kind of informal arrangements actually come into being. But the formal world, in the form of law, I think is very important in sort of, in setting this. And this is one paper which does never really get, I know of this, and this is incredibly interesting paper, and I can give you the reference for it. In fact, I've has Professor Botha joined us? Yeah.
I think Professor Botha is with us, but I don't think I think his video is still not working. Professor Botha,
so
would you like me to share?
Shouldn't I?
As you prefer, Professor Singh. If you'd like to finish your thought, we'd love to hear
Okay,
it.
I just quickly just say what the sort of paper that I was basically talking about. Tells you that empirical work shows that when you're talking about across the world, countries which had better labor laws were actually doing better with exports, with export manufacture. So some of this discourse really gets, I think, I don't know, for whatever reasons, it's never, and yeah. So I think Professor Botha should, that's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Singh. I think then what I will do is share Professor Botha's PowerPoint, and he can just indicate for me when to look here. Righty. Professor Botha, can you see the PowerPoint that I've shared? Professor Botha, can you hear us?
I don't think so, not yet, because he does not have the mic icon next to his name.
Professor Botha, can you hear us now?
I think he's just joined. Said so. Said he's a host.
Yes.
We should be able to hear him now, I think.
We should be able to, because everything is connected. Professor Botha, can you hear us?
Maybe we should give him some more time, and we have some questions from the attendees. So maybe we can ask Professor Singh the question. In the meantime, Professor Botha will solve the technical problems. So should I read?
Yes, please.
Should I read the question? Okay, so we have a question. We often hear that countries have an obligation to attract big business, but if we look at Europe, Ireland, and the Netherlands, courted international business.
Okay, good afternoon. Let me just click down here. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can finally hear you, Prof.
I've connected now on my mobile phone, so just bear with me.
Fantastic.
I'm not sure why it's blocking it, because I did restart in the settings, but I will have to check that out, because I could hear everything that you say, but unfortunately, yeah, I apologize for that. I think it is the update that I've done yesterday, and yeah, my apologies for the delay.
No problem. Thank you very much for being with us. Professor, I will be your faithful assistant here today. So you will just guide me in changing the slides as we go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Without further ado, can you maybe go to the next slide? So the couple of slides that will follow now is just to set the scene in terms of the South African scenario. And I want you to have a look at the screen in terms of the population. So South African population roughly stands at 58.8 million. Can we move to the next slide? In terms of people that work, you'll see that between ages of 15 and 64 years old, you'll see 16.4 million of the 23.5 million are employed. And obviously that creates some problems in terms of the numbers of unemployment, which currently stands at 30.1%. If you can move to the next slide, I just want to show you in terms of the formal sector. You will see the formal sector in South Africa accounts for 68.9% of total employment. But the next slide will show you some very, very serious problems that we're facing in South Africa. You'll see the total number of persons employed decreased from 10.196 million in Q1 of 2020 to 9.5, almost 10 million to in Q2 in 2020. Now, if you go to the next slide, you will also see that the number of unemployed people in South Africa increased from 4.7 million to 7.1 million in Q1, and obviously it's now higher. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see gross earnings paid for the quarter ended 2020 decreased by 82 billion, and that is a reduction of 11.3% when compared to the previous quarter. The next slide will also emphasize that we have a very high level of unemployment. Now, obviously, COVID-19 added to this problem, but we also had systemic issues in terms of unemployment and high unemployment rates in the last couple of years. And that was just now aggravated by means of COVID-19. Now, if we look at the next slide, you'll see that South Africa also has a national development plan. And this national development plan was amended. It's now the National Development Plan 2030. Now, this plan articulates that it wants to eliminate poverty and reduce inequality, raise levels of employment, and through productivity, growth the earnings of the working people. And you would see that I'm not going to read everything on the slide. South Africa needs faster growth and more inclusive growth. Now, obviously, now the reality that we face with 30.1% unemployment is kind of counterproductive, seeing that this plan was already in its initial phases, it's been rolled out, and now we have to go back to the drawing board. And this brings us to the next slide. Now, in terms of when we look at decent standard of living, this is not just unique in South Africa, but I think in terms of the historic realities of South Africa, we still grappled with inequality in South Africa, housing, water, sanitation. We have a national electricity provider that cannot provide the capacity of electricity in South Africa. We had load shedding, which is not common in European countries, where we have to make stages to sit in the dark, transport issue, education, to mention only a few. If we can go to the next slide. So the question now is, how can we create employment? How can we grow the economy by looking at sustainability? And this is, I think, what the plan was with the National Development Plan. And if you look at sustainability, you'll see it encapsulates quite a few things. The economic factors, the social factors, and obviously governance issues. And we are faced with quite a few problems regarding sustainability and how we'll overcome some of the systemic problems that contributes to unemployment, as well as impedes on the growth of the economy. Can you just skip the next slide? Yes, and this brings us to the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm just going to touch quickly on this because I want to get into the nitty-gritty stuff of my discussion. Now, again, if we look at Sustainable Development Goal SDG 8, you will see it's to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Because of the legacy of apartheid, we are still faced with a huge problem regarding unemployment, inequality, basic services, etc., etc. So it makes sense why this will be one of the Sustainable Development Goals that we actually incorporated in terms of the National Development Plan, which brings us to the ILO. If you look at the ILO declaration, which is the next slide, you would see that there's some overlap between what United Nations is professing as well as what the ILO is going for. And again, here, the theme here is providing decent work for all, to seize opportunities for all, etc., etc. And I want to take you to the next slide. Now, SDG 8 is connected to quite a few other SDGs: reduction of inequality, promotion of peace, justice, strong institutions, eradication of poverty and hunger. And this is not just unique to South Africa: quality education, good health, well-being, and gender equality. You find this cross-cutting across the world, and it's more prevalent in some countries than others. I want you to skip the next two slides, which brings us to the realities. Now, in May 2010, when the then president, Jacob Zuma, appointed the National Planning Commission, there were quite a few challenges that were identified. Now, these realities are still in existence 26 years after the new dispensation, or in the new dispensation. Too few people work. The quality of school education for Black people especially is poor. Spatial divides hobble inclusive development. Infrastructure is poor, etc., etc. This brings us then to what I want to discuss. If we look now at the realities in terms of COVID-19 and beyond, you are aware that quite a number of thousands of people have been killed worldwide. And this brings the question regarding whether a universal basic income should be provided as a long-term strategy or as a temporary measure. Now, obviously, there are proponents that say that this should only be a temporary measure because it's unsustainable. And this is why I brought sustainability into the mix. Because obviously, to address the effects of COVID-19, you will have to look at sustainable measures in terms of growing the economy, in terms of overcoming COVID-19 consequences, as well as eradicate unemployment. And unemployment, as you already have seen, is at 30.1%. Now, just to sketch you another reality, in South Africa, in July 2020, 18.369,977, almost 19 million social grants were paid out in July of 2020 in South Africa. That is a very high number of people that are dependent on this. But as I've already illustrated, we have really some inequality issues to address. Now, there's some measures that the government has now proposed in terms of dealing with COVID-19 and the effects, especially on businesses. The Small Business Development Minister recently initiated a proposal that they will fund small business owners or informal traders an amount of R1,000. Now, obviously, as you are aware of, the small businesses have suffered severely. We had most probably one of the harshest lockdowns in the world. South Africa literally came to a standstill from the 26th of March, and we are still in our lockdown, but we're now in level 1. But for example, people could not go to work, people could not travel, etc., etc. It's only recently that they've actually made changes regarding relaxing this. But one of the realities I've already identified is the problem, and this is unfortunately one of those things that we've inherited from the previous dispensation. The state-owned enterprises, we have quite a few of them. Eskom that provides electricity. The CEO of Eskom recently also came out and said, look here, it is unsustainable to provide electricity from a service provider with outdated infrastructure. And therefore, we need other renewable types of energy. We cannot only rely on coal. And I'm glad that they've made that decision now. But also, we are battling with problems with our national broadcaster, as well as South African Airways that's been bailed out again. Now, the Reserve Bank has also cautioned us that the public debt of South Africa is really expanding, and this can create real problems in terms of repaying our debt, and further recessions may be taking place. So now the question comes whether a mere reform of the present neoliberal system that we've inherited from the previous dispensation is enough or not, and whether mere amendments to such a policy would be sufficient. Now, as I've already indicated, we've been in the new dispensation for 26 years now, but it is clear that some of the policies are outdated. It cannot cater for the realities of the new dispensation. So how are we going to deal post-lockdown with these realities? We're also faced with a national governing party that is faced with their own infighting factions, as well as corruption. But we're also sitting with a failing healthcare system. I think that is also adding insult to injury, clearly showing that the neoliberal system that we are currently utilizing is not sufficient to address the inequality issues in South Africa. And therefore, we sit with quite a high number of people that either find themselves in the informal sectors. We find people that migrate from other African countries that are setting up informal structures that are not recognized by the government. And also, if you look at, for example, trade unions battle to formalize these workers, which is evident in terms of the recent Constitutional Court case. They've stated that domestic workers as vulnerable workers and as unorganized workers should also be protected by the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act. And this begs the question, why a government that comes from such a movement, a social movement, political change, economic change, never realized that domestic workers who are in most instances not protected and not registered should not be protected in terms of the definition of an employee, in terms of occupational health and safety legislation. The court now said they can now claim from the compensation fund if they are injured at the workplace. And this brings us to another question. Whether the labor legislation that we have enacted in the 1990s, which were very important, and the first piece of legislation is outdated, and we should revisit the legislation because it is failing the most vulnerable workers that it intended to protect. It also shows that if you look at South African labor legislation, the problem exists regarding the narrow definition of employee. And there's a drive that we should widen the scope to, for example, include more vulnerable workers, more workers in the precarious group, more workers in the informal economy, and that workers should move freely between the formal and the informal economy. So lack of regulation is also adding insult to injury. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Elmarie, wrote a doctorate on women as vulnerable workers specifically. And this is, if you look at the informal economy, you look at domestic workers, they are the ones that are mostly vulnerable, and we're failing them on those levels. So the model that we've adopted, the new liberal model, is flawed and has failed us. And I've been vocal that we should renegotiate the social contract that actually established the new dispensation in the early 1990s. But what we are faced with is the fact that these workers do not have adequate social security, social protection. And this begs the question whether trade unions should revisit their role in terms of how they should negotiate the new social contract. And currently, if you look at the Confederation of Trade Unions, they're in a tripartite alliance with the Communist Party as well as the ANC. And I think it is proven that marriage is outdated, and maybe it should be time to revisit that relationship. Maybe they should divorce and focus on the social contract and the negotiation of the social contract. As I've stated also earlier, you would also find that if we look at, if you can just move on one slide, if you look at corruption, corruption is really rife in South Africa, and we're not unique in the world. I see the other countries also faced with this. We had huge scandals with PPE tenders that were awarded to people who didn't know anything. So the money disappeared, and the most vulnerable people that were affected in communities in the rural areas did not receive the relief the government actually wanted them to receive. If you also look at the bailing out, we are pumping in another 10.5 billion rand into a failing national carrier. Now we have spent millions of rands, billions of rands on the failing SAA. And this begs the question, whether the government should jump ship and let go of this sinking ship. Other countries don't have a national carrier. They gave that up because it's unsustainable. And I think this is really the problem that we are faced with in South Africa. Now, if we look at the next slide, the way forward, I think it is important that when we deal with issues, you can move to the next slide, please. If we look at moving forward, I think looking at accountability in terms of dealing with corruption would be one of the starting points of the current government in trying to protect or trying to remedy the situation in terms of growing the economy, and, for example, also trying to bring down the unemployment number, which is standing at 30.1%. We are currently also busy with the state capture inquiry, where many things have happened on that front, and the accountability of the guilty parties is still hanging in the air. And this is really maybe where a zero tolerance approach should be applied regarding corruption, because for example, social grants disappear, people receive tenders who are dead, etc., etc. So the very people that are in charge of the funds that's supposed to go to the vulnerable groups are really adding insult to injury. So I've made just a few proposals. I think this is obviously not a closed list in terms of how we can maybe move forward in terms of the system. I think the livelihoods of poor, the employment opportunities should be an emphasis in terms of turning the country around. We should maybe look at skilling and reskilling people in certain sectors, especially in context of the fourth industrial revolution. South Africa is still grappling with the third industrial revolution, and also now embarking on fourth industrial revolution realities. So we're a little bit of a bipolar system in terms of trying to address inequality issues of the past, inequality issues that are currently existing and moving forward. We also sit with huge infrastructure issues in terms of dealing with this. The national minimum wage that is proposed is 20 Rand per hour. So if you work for 40 hours per week, it amounts to 3,500 Rand per month. But obviously there are some exclusions, some sectors and some industries that can negotiate their own minimum wage. So this is actually not working at a large scale. We should also look at the concentration of ownership in many sectors. To a very large scale, broad-based Black economic empowerment has failed in South Africa, and the people at the grassroots, the vulnerable workers, the vulnerable communities, do not see the money that is supposed to come their way in terms of economic transformation and financial transformation. Then, as I've mentioned, social transformation realities should be addressed. And here, the new social contract should be renegotiated. And I think it's fundamental that trade unions, as pressure groups and social partners, should really question their role in terms of the current dispensation. And I know in other countries, trade unions have been vocal in terms of driving change in terms of economic policies and moving away from outdated systems. Maybe that is the way forward for South Africa. I also think there should be better synergy between labor, company and empowerment legislation. At this stage, if you look, for example, at the Companies Act of 2008, it actually provides quasi-participation rights to workers. But if you look at the issues, for example, proposed at the Social and Ethics Committee, and I've written on this multiple times, it deals with issues such as labor, social, economic development of workers, but workers do not have a voice on this committee. And I think that is an oversight and was short-sighted by the legislator not to actually involve labor in that. The transition from work to school and better quality education should also be facilitated. We still sit with schools with pit toilets where scholars fall in the toilets and they die. I think this is really unacceptable 26 years into this dispensation. So that should really be a priority in terms of maybe addressing some of the issues, especially for the vulnerable. And I've already mentioned lifelong learning, upskilling, reskilling, but I think better collaboration should take place between public and private bodies. And I think this has been the us versus them mentality, and this comes from the previous dispensation that was inherited, and there are still characteristics that are very present, especially if you look from a social movement or a labor movement perspective. If you can move to the last slide. I also think that if you look at unemployment in South Africa, and this is really shocking, there's a very big percentage of university or college graduates with diplomas and degrees that cannot find work in South Africa. So we should ask ourselves the question, are we upskilling students and are we equipping them with the right skill sets? It is really worrying for me that we send people out in the workplace and they cannot find jobs with a certificate or with a diploma. So that is something that we really will have to revisit. And I think here, connected to what I've already said, is that there should be better enhancement of social dialogue, work participation. And I'm professing that trade unions should be responsible in the behavior. Trade unions should react if a CEO receives 100 million Rand bonus and thereafter decides to retrench 2,000 workers. There's something wrong with the system if trade unions do not speak out against that. And I think the reason why I am pinpointing trade unions, because I come from a labor background, but I also delve into the economic side. And I think they're fundamental in terms of driving this change. But they will have to cut the umbilical cord. They cannot be in bed with government and with business. They have to do what's best for workers, and they will have to put the interests of workers first. So building trust and having a shared vision is very important in such an initiative. I've already mentioned that macroeconomic policies should have aims as the central objective that promotes sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth. full and productive employment and decent work for all. Now, if you look at the objects of the Labour Relations Act, which is one of the first pieces of legislation in the law books in South Africa, this followed just after the first democratic election. This was even before we had a final constitution. We had a Labour Relations Act that provided for protection of workers. And if you look at the objects, you would see that economic development or empowerment of workers is one of the objectives. And this has failed miserably. So there's a disconnect in terms of what legislation tried to do and what it is actually achieving. And that's why I think why we face with these problems. Trade, industrial, and sectoral policies that promote decent work and enhance productivity in context of the third industrial revolution, moving into the fourth industrial revolution, should be evident here. We should have a smooth transition. And I think that is where we have to relook some of the issues. Investment in infrastructure and strategic sectors to address drivers of transformative change in the world of work should also be a priority. If you, for example, look at the mining industry, it's an industry that is really not translated in terms of empowering the communities where they make money from. And mostly these are foreign companies that mine in these poor communities. And if things get tough, they withdraw from those communities and towns die. So I think that is something that will also have to be relooked. Policies and incentives that promote sustainable and inclusive growth in the transition between the formal and the informal economy, I think should better be facilitated and should be a priority. And I think this is really important, that trade unions should look at precarious work arrangements, the erosion of the traditional employment relationship, and fragmentation of the collective bargaining units. You would find in some sectors that trade unions do not work along, and we have rivalry between trade unions that is really not benefiting the immediate community and the precarious workers that find themselves, for example, in those communities. So I propose from a social movement that trade unions should take a driving seat in terms of maybe driving regulation in terms of how we can provide interventions in economic and social policy, but also work along with government and be vocal in terms of how government is failing society, and maybe should take a stance also in terms of the impact of corruption in South Africa. And I think this is fundamental, and I want to end off with a quote. And this is a quote from Sanford Scram from a 2019 chapter. And he says the follows, and I'm opening the quote. Trump emphasizes being a winner, not a loser. A Trumpian neoliberal perspective of a world of winners and losers is blind to the underlying neoliberal relations of poverty that significantly create the poverty that poor people must endure. As inequality skyrockets under neoliberalism, as inequality skyrockets under neoliberalism, the welfare state increasingly is at risk of not being able to counteract the adverse effects for people on the bottom. Instead, a neoliberal process of responsibilization is put in place. Manufacture austerity, starve the beast, hollow out the welfare state, insist on market compliance via an ethic of personal responsibility, discipline recipients for failure to be market compliant, and blame the poor for their own poverty as a product of their own personal choices. Now, end the quote. Now, in South Africa, the reality is, yes, we did inherit a system that was based on a neoliberal model. And 26 years in this dispensation, it is clear that the system as it stands now is not working. Are we going to cut and paste from somewhere else? I think not. I think we should look at the realities of Africa, and we should look at the adverse effects from the previous dispensation, but we should also look at the realities of the current dispensation and where the current dispensation failed. And I think once we have done that, it's the only way we can move forward in terms of maybe coming up with a system that can address the 30.1% unemployment rate, also make provision for a system where less people are dependent on social grants, and also maybe grow entrepreneurship and economic activity, and also bridge the divide between people moving from the formal economy and the informal economy, and maybe provide support to people in small, medium enterprises. That is the only way we are going to take the economy forward and actually address these issues. And that brings to the end. If you want to go to the last slide, thank you very much. It was very quick. I apologize if I went too fast.
Thank you very much, Professor Botha. That was a lovely presentation. So okay, sorry, I'm just trying to make logistical sense of everything going on around me. To Professors Singh and Botha, thank you very much for your informative and enlightening presentations. I really tremendously enjoyed both, and personally feel that I have grown in terms of thinking capacity and the thoughts within that capacity from both your presentations. If I may say, the aim of these seminars, and perhaps even the aim of our broader research network as a whole, has been to bring to the center those that are within the peripheries. So by this, we mean obviously, countries that fall outside the central discourses. So, countries that don't fall under the categories of first world or developed countries that are on the forefront of these discussions. But also within those peripheries, there are certain centers that are created, and those that fall outside of these centers have a discourse which needs to be brought to the attention of the globe as well. I think what was highlighted really beautifully in both presentations was exactly that there are certain realities of law, of labor, and of economics, where these structures have failed the people, failed those broadly on the peripheries of the global discourse, and even within those peripheries, those who fall once again outside the central framework. I think that what Professor Botha had ended with, this idea of transposing the structures, systems, and ideologies from the from one place to another, rather, without categorizing, is not necessarily a lasting solution, as we have seen in the example of South Africa. I think also, if I may point out before my next point, just to make it more clear, when Professor Botha was referring to a minimum wage of 3,500 Rand in South Africa, if I can put that into a context which some of our attendees may understand better, 3,500 Rand is equal to 185 euros. Okay, so this is minimum wage. So with that in mind, so Professor Botha mentioned this directly, and Professor Singh alluded to this in his discussion on the role of law in labor, is the definition of employees, and how this actually affects the precariat, if you will. I think what's very interesting in the Indian context is that many many Western, or let's say developed countries, use labor within India as a source of cheap labor, if you will. This goes to the technology sector, you know, Apple, as well as the manufacturing sector, both together, who claim to be creating labor opportunities within India by doing this, but where there is such a huge gap in the definitions of labor and in minimum wage in countries such as India and South Africa, I don't know that this is necessarily for the benefit of these countries, but rather for the benefit of the capitalist powers outside of these countries. But without going on for too long, I could really continue this forever, but I would really like to give an opportunity to our attendees to post their questions. I want to thank you both again for that informative presentation. Perhaps what I will do is give the floor to Eirni, who will start off perhaps with the question by Daniel Kiwi, which we did not get through fully, and then to the remainder of the questions. And if there is time, I would love to pick your brains a little bit further, Professors Singh and Botha. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghazal. Thank you, professors, for this amazing presentation. So I will continue with the question of Daniel Kiwi. Thank you so much for your question, which, if I'm not wrong, is addressed to Professor Singh. Even if it is already answered, it seems, in the Q&A window in written, I would like to read loud the question so we can hear Professor Singh develop a bit more his answer. So we often hear that countries have an obligation to attract big business, but if we look at Europe, Ireland, and the Netherlands, courted international business by providing tax certainty. To what extent is tax certainty more relevant than labor laws? And is labor law the golden calf that capital can sacrifice? Professor Singh?
As I responded on the thing, yes, and it's yes, absolutely, right. I agree with that, and labor is therefore, ironically, very strangely, it's always something that is the first thing to go. That's where everybody wants to lower the wage, have easy conditions, etc., etc. It's much easier. And it's they're very much in the nature of things than to go after labor. And in the Indian case, particularly, this is quite resonant because India has gone ahead and imposed a lot of retrospective taxation, which has been challenged, and the Indian government absolutely insisted that they were not going to go back on that. And to me, that's really important because, and we are also talking in this forum a little bit, I think, about the relationship between various peoples of the world, if you like. That's important because it's not just it's all of us in some kind of a thing. And this is an area which is a little outside of this, but it is very important that some version of some notion, and I mean some notion of rule of law, actually permeate the world in a certain kind of a sense, and in the economic world. That's very important for me, thinking this out, because that is the basis on which then you can also have a human right governance of the world, if you like. There is a something which, as in local situations, as in the words of Professor Botha, who asked for this newer social contract within South Africa, I think that's exactly what we need in India as well, in terms of whatever. But, if you're just going to be sovereign and within your own self, I don't know, sometimes the political forces are so warped in some ways that, you sometimes can't get out of certain kinds of traps that you're in. So an international order, I know there is a lot of problem with the international order. You get power and this and that, and we can think about all that, but at the same time, that kind of thing is very important, and once that comes into place, then I think I think it is Kevi or Daniel, right? His point of saying that this is a golden goose, which you sort of then thing, and taxation is something that is completely ignored. That is the kind of stuff which probably gets in much more foreign investment than labor laws. I've got a paper to that effect. I've actually done empirical work which shows you your international arbitration regime affects foreign investment a lot more. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. So maybe I can proceed to the other interesting question that we have from Bruno. So Bruno says, I would like to come back to something that was suggested by Professor Singh, which is the centrality and the value of work for political imagination. There are two interesting provocative essays, one by Paul Lafargue, Le droit à la paresse, and another by Bernard Russell, In praise of idleness, if I'm pronouncing right, which question precisely the mythical value of work. Could both speakers expand on the potential of the universal basic income as a mechanism to deal with economic insecurity beyond the idea that work sets you free? Arbeit macht frei. Thank you, Bruno. So maybe we can start with Professor Botha, if you wish to comment on this very interesting question.
Thank you for that. Yes, I think the universal basic income might not be an immediate fix or long-term fix, especially if you look at the problems we faced in South Africa, the realities we face in South Africa. Now, we really are already grappling with a very big number of people that are unemployed. We're facing people that are uneducated, that live in very bad conditions, as well as the problem with corruption, especially if you look at how corrupt officials have been dealt with in terms of liability. For example, social grants that's supposed to go to vulnerable people have disappeared. So before I would go out and say a universal basic grant for everyone, I think that we should revisit the systemic problems that contribute to this. I'm not against it, but I think that we should also identify people to get out of the system of unemployment and overcome the inequality issues and the stumbling blocks that I've already identified. And the problem is, unfortunately, in South Africa, is that we have most probably the best constitution, of one of the best constitutions in the world. We have most probably one of the best corporate governance systems in the world. We have some of the best labor legislation in the world. And still we are grappling with issues that an advanced country with a sophisticated regulatory framework is not supposed to deal with. So we will have to address the systemic issues. But we also should free people from being dependent on social grants and a universal basic income. So I think that dealing with the effects of COVID-19, that is most probably in the interim or the short term, or maybe the medium term, a solution. But then we will have to come up with creative ways in terms of growing economies that have been really failing in terms of COVID-19, but also before COVID-19, and we have a number of issues. For example, we should restructure or privatize some of the state-owned enterprises. It's happened over the world. The government should have more biting power in terms of liability issues, especially have a zero tolerance approach. If we, for example, now get money from the World Bank again, or we get money from Treasury, there's no guarantee that the money will end up where it is supposed to go. And this is one of the issues that I've identified with the PPE tenders that some of them were awarded to people that were dead. There's the corrupt element. Some of the tenders ended up in people that knew nothing about PPE, and then the most vulnerable groups, for example, did not get it. We also have a feeding scheme in South Africa where there was a scandal where products that were supposed to go for the precarious people, the most vulnerable, ended up on shops being sold, regardless of the fact that there's a label that says this is for human consumption only, it is not for sale, it forms part of the feeding scheme. So those are systemic issues in terms of dealing with it. So yes, I think a universal basic income grant can assist the most vulnerable in maybe the short to medium term, but not in the long term. It's unsustainable because our working populace that contribute to the tax coffers in South Africa is shrinking. Increasing taxes has also failed and proved that it's not sustainable. So we really have to relook at where we came from, where we are now, where we're heading, and how we're going to address these issues. And I think the things that I've mentioned are possible solutions in terms of addressing this. Obviously, this will not happen overnight, but I think we should do some introspection in terms of why we are 26 years into a new dispensation, still having these issues in a country that is supposed to have a regulatory framework that is more advanced than in some of the European countries or some of the countries in North America. And I think that is fundamental. But I do support such a grant, but I think in the short to medium term and not long term, because it's unsustainable. The money must come from somewhere. And the economy is already in this it's already failing, unemployment is high, so adding another layer in terms of social grants is most probably not sustainable in the long term.
Thank you so much, Professor Botha. Professor Singh, would you like to say something?
Yeah, briefly, you know, when I kind of mentioned this, it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek about Gandhi, but not also. So, you know, there is the, you know, with universal basic income, there is a resources, ultimately a resources and an incentive sort of problem, which is there, but I can only sort of think back to the Indian case where the most successful social security type of thing that has happened in this country has been work related. The what they call the Monray stuff, where you know, the state sort of gives you money for, you know, literally digging ditches in a crude sort of a way, that, you know, when people have absolutely no other source of employment but some very you know, basic livelihood concerns are there. So this is something that was done by the, what they call in the political thing, the first UPA government. In fact, some of the best legislation in this country, the most humane legislation of this country, took place in that era. And it has literally been downhill thereafter on that kind of thing. So, but, you know, frankly, on this universal basic income, I really don't know what to say. I haven't made up my own mind. I don't don't know. I think I really want to spend some time thinking about it a little bit. And thank you so much, Bruno, for telling me that Bertrand Russell has written something on this. And are we fetishizing work? Is work a fetish? I don't know. And Gandhi says, no, it isn't a fetish. It is essential. It is essential to the human whatever. So I think it's something to ponder over and look over carefully. But I can't say anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Singh. I open the floor to our attendees. If there is any other question that you want to ask our professors, and if there is no other question, then we can go to our panelists. Ghazal, would you like to?
Yes, thank you, Eirni. I wanted to clarify something. So it's actually a conversation that I have had on several occasions with Eirni regarding the responsibility of the private sector. And we have very different positions on this. For the sake of anonymity, I will not declare which of us has taken which position, but I would like to hear a little bit from our speakers. Professor Botha, you mentioned that as part of these solutions moving forward, that some responsibility must be put on the private sector. And Professor Singh, in the same breath, you mentioned the responsibility of the employers towards employees. My question is the following. Does the adding of responsibilities to the private sector or to employers, does it not unjustifiably remove responsibility from the states who, according to this social contract, must take on certain responsibilities, given that their citizens are sitting there, they're not making war, they're not, I don't know, running around killing each other. They're paying their taxes, abiding by the laws, more or less, right? So they are abiding by their end of the social contract. Are we not then taking responsibility away from the state? Or is it that we must accept the limitations of the states, given the realities of corruption, at least, and say, well, they're not doing anything. We need to take this into our own hands.
Thank you. Can I go first?
Go ahead, please, Professor.
Thanks. I think the social contract is not just only applicable to government. I think the social contract extends to everyone, whether you are a private-owned business, whether you're the government, whether you're a private citizen. And I think the realities of the benefits that you get from society and the country that you live in and the immediate community should be evident. And I think that is very, very important when you look at the social contract. And yes, in South Africa, we have realities from the past that is still prevalent in South Africa today. But I think also there was a transition in terms of some people benefiting from the system now that previously did not benefit. So I think from that perspective, you have responsibility as a business owner, as a private citizen, as a public servant to give back to the most vulnerable. And I think somewhere along the line, that was the idea in this new dispensation that was negotiated in the 1990s in terms of the transition in South Africa. That was fundamentally the idea. But if you look at, for example, companies that benefited in the previous dispensation, those companies, to a very large extent, walked away basically not being accountable for the injustices. I'm not saying punish people forever and forever. I just think that we should go back in terms of maybe we should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think Professor Thuli Madonsela was vocal regarding this. Maybe we neglected to have an economic Truth and Reconciliation committee or cleansing ceremony or platform. And I think that's fundamental, especially if you look at the system that was inherited. If you look at state-owned enterprises of Africa, they were tailored for a specific time period. Those state-owned enterprises have become outdated. The system that they're trying to feed in is unfortunately not assisting. For example, if you look at the railway system, it is a mess. If you look at infrastructure in South Africa, we have toll roads that toll everyone that drives on these roads. The organization that runs it is a mess. If you look at Eskom that provides electricity, that's a mess. And the reason why they're a mess is because they were generated in a dispensation where 60 million, almost 60 million people did not utilize that, and South Africa did not partake in the global economy and the realities of being integrated again in the world. And also, we have opened our borders to migrant workers from other countries in the African continent. And we're also faced with that reality where we have people that flee from other countries, where there is war, where there is some injustices, where there is some criminal activities. So the dynamics in South Africa changed drastically. And I think therefore the responsibility should be shared. And I think what I've mentioned here, it is for me a big problem. And I'm not against business in what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, how can you pay out 100 million rand bonus to a CEO and then you retrench workers? Then you're adding to the 30.1% unemployment rate. And it's evident if you look at South Africa now, some companies retrenched workers or laid off workers unfairly before the national lockdown in March, knowing that they cannot go to the CCMA to take the case. And then they come there with a prepared case, and they, the worker that's supposed to be protected by the system is still vulnerable and disadvantaged. For example, at arbitration at the CCMA, an employee where there's an allegation of misconduct is not allowed to bring legal representation if the employer does not allow it. That means that that worker is disadvantaged because they have to go represent themselves on legal matters that they know nothing of. The employer on the other side sends some HR representative that's got some understanding in terms of how labor law works. That is how the system is unequal. If you look at the number of cases in terms of unfair dismissal, for example, it ends up at the CCMA, the employers, most instances, don't even pitch up for conciliation. So I think the responsibility also in terms of how you treat your employees will go back to privately owned businesses as well as public companies as well as state-owned enterprises. And I mean the whole debacle regarding, for example, Dudu Myeni, who was the chair of the of the board of SA that blocked quite a few deals, and the court found that she's a delinquent director, and she still appeals. She doesn't take accountability, responsibility, and there's no accountability in terms of losing the taxpayers billions of rands, and the bailouts just keep on. I think that is fundamental. So the responsibility should be shared, and I'm glad that there is some movements now. For example, people have been vocal now in businesses to support that you must pay small, medium enterprise within 30 days. I don't know if you saw that. It is trending on Twitter. It's a movement in South Africa supported by big businesses, government, etc., etc. I think that's a very good initiative because those are the businesses that suffer the most. If I walk around my city, the malls are empty, the restaurants have closed down. People that were dependent on the small wage that they have received are unemployed. the government system is failing them in terms of social grants. Some of the people disappear in the system. Some of the grants disappear. There is corruption regarding the payment of these small grants. People wait for days for a 350 Rand bailout from the government. That is not how you treat your people as a government, and that's also not how businesses should treat their workers. And I think fundamentally we should go back to the drawing table and renegotiate the social contract. As private citizens, we should also stand up against government and private business if they subject workers and vulnerable people to these injustices. I think it's really appalling that a country like South Africa, with a constitution as brilliant as South Africa, has failed its people. And I'm not negative. I've benefited from the system and I'm trying to give back. But I think the movement should be from the general populace too, as well as business, and people in government should stand up against corrupt officials. Said, you will not, you need to step down if you're implicated in corruption. You need to clear your name, and the moment it's clear, you can come back in terms of doing your duty as a public servant. It is appalling that these people are moved around from one public servant job to a next public servant job. The same with accountability of directors. If you look at the Marcus Joost debacle, it is appalling what has happened there. He is getting slaps on the wrist by the JSE, etc., etc. He can afford that. His money is not in South Africa. So the shareholders lost their investments. People invested their pensions in the companies. And I think that is fundamental why I am vocal that the social contract is, you should share the responsibility. It is not just business, it is not just government, it is also the general populace that can speak out and put pressure on private business as well as government to make these changes. Otherwise, we will sit with the effects. I mean, the personal tax rate in South Africa is very, very high compared to some European countries. The rates are on par with some European countries, but in those countries, you have social security, you have free education, you have free health, you have free retirement. We have to, in addition to paying high levels of income tax. So something needs to stop somewhere. And I think we all share that responsibility, if that answers your question. I can go on and on about this.
Thank you, Professor Botha. Professor Singh?
Right. The tone with which Professor Botha, what he said about shared responsibility, I would very much, go along with precisely that. But just to qualify that a little bit, the responsibility of either the state or the private sector also gets fashioned in a milieu, if you like, in a setting in which these various things are worked out. Now, I think there have been, one of the big problems that we have in India is that particularly in contemporary times, I think, the state and some bits and pieces of the private world, and this is inevitable, it happens all over the world, but you need to have like institutional structures, or I could call it the social contract, or other things which control that. And there is a kind of a mix between the state and the private, which is some version of crony capitalism, if you like, which can be very, very difficult. So never doesn't even become an either-or kind of a problem then. It's a collusion, if you like. It's the thing, and that can be very oppressive thing. So since you've sort of raised this very quickly, and I'd like to have, I want to say this in this forum, at some point, is that when we were talking about South Africa and the trade unions and so on and so forth, one of the big problems in India is that the way the law has been weakened now, the trade unions have diminished considerably. I can't even do any meaningful research on trade unions because I don't know how many trade unions there are in this country. So that, that's a kind of a thing. It is very important, though, for the private sector indeed to have certain responsibilities and stuff. And ultimately, at the end of the day, with the enormous inequalities which have been, everybody who then, looks at macro data across the world, by now we have, we have Piketty's work and so on and so forth. There is enormous inequality, and somewhere a redistributive exercise will have to take place. Now, will that going to be, there is some bit of it through, I think, the private sector will have to think about this. CSR, we open up something very difficult out there, but it's got the imagination through which this could happen, but we don't know. My colleagues in my university and some students who in the Indian CSR case, they're so skeptical about it. They just say it's a device by which companies avoiding tax, right? So anyways. Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Singh. So it's true that we ran out of time and we are a bit late. So I wonder if you have some more time for our last question coming from Omkar. Do you have some more time? Or?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. So very quickly, Omkar is asking a very interesting question. What philosophical mindset needs to change so that the gig economy is not considered separate from the casual labor market? Is it just a class divide, urban, rural, conversational divide that differentiates one as a freelancer as compared to a daily contract worker? So maybe one of you or even both desire to answer to that very interesting question. Professor Botha, I don't know if you want to comment.
Yes, okay, thank you. Yes, I think it's a very important question because if you look at the gig economy, there have been challenges across the world in terms of regulation of, for example, workers that work for Uber as Uber drivers. And some countries have been very vocal and they've implemented bans on Uber in terms of trying to protect, for example, registered taxi industries. Now in South Africa, our taxi industry to a very large extent is disconnected. We have the mobile taxis that plays a very historic role because of the fact that in the previous dispensation, public transport was not really provided to people that fell within the generic black group. So they either had to walk far to get to a bus that was not reliable. So these minibus taxis played a very vital role in terms of getting people from point A to point B. And that is still the reality in South Africa. But now in the mix, we also now have Uber and Taxify. But those industries or that services are not regulated. So there has been some people that have been vocal in terms of trying to regulate these industries and also make those persons or classify them as employees. But if you look, for example, now recently in this election in the United States, where they still hasn't certified the results. In California, for example, they voted that those services, people that work for them are not classified as employees. So it's a very different movement in terms of that specific state. But if you look, for example, in Brazil, they've treated it a little bit differently in terms of making the taxi drivers, the people that drive these Ubers, partners. So they're not regarded as employees. Maybe that is some solution in terms of dealing with these vulnerable groups that find themselves in the gig economy, in industries that might possibly place them in a precarious situation. The other option is to include them in labor protections and in social protection. So that is also maybe something that that needs to be considered, but that will depend also on the regulatory framework in a specific country. In South Africa, the movement and the drive is to change the labor legislation to be more inclusive and to not use the narrow definition of an employee, because people that are self-employed and people that are independent contractors are not included in those protections. And therefore, people that find themselves in the informal economy, as I've mentioned earlier, and mostly are women, as I've also mentioned earlier, are the vulnerable ones. And I think that is very important. If you look at the gig economy, that you will have to look at the place of the gig economy within the bigger regulatory framework and the contribution that they can make. I don't think over-regulation is necessarily the way to go, but I think it should be considered, because we are moving into the technological era, especially with the realities of the fourth industrial revolution. So we will have to adapt, and therefore labor legislation will have to adapt. Therefore trade unions will have to adapt in terms of looking at how they negotiate collective bargaining and how they can find better protections for the members and for the people that actually they profess to work for. So I think there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but I think there are some things that can be in place in terms of providing protections to the most vulnerable, especially in the developments in these new digital platforms.
Thank you so much, Professor Botha. Professor Singh, would you like to?
Yeah, right. This is of course the big question. Philosophically, I think you go back to who is a worker, and worker is somebody who can be who's you can directly control. So there is no direct control here, and so you're an independent contractor, and you get outside that whole relationship which is supposed to define labor in the traditional sense. And in California, there was supposed to be triumph where you were actually included or pulled into that relationship for a moment. But very soon, the companies have basically turned around and convinced the voting public. And it's quite crazy. It's something like, I think 7, now for you to change the law in California, you need 7/8 of the legislature out there to change the law. So now you've sort of gotten pulled out. Now, as Professor Botha said, in the same breath, you've also got this story about having newer ways of organizing production and organizing economic activity. So is this going to inhibit that? So I don't know. I think maybe there is an answer or something lies in really refurbishing our imagination out here, and the sort of what I was trying to hint at earlier, maybe I didn't come across fully enough. The labor has for too long in law, and I'm talking about like in the formal imagination of law, it has maybe for too long been trapped by the law of contract and contract alone. So maybe there are other areas, and of property, and I mean, not that I don't know how property would exactly connect to the gig problem. Yeah, but there are other areas and other ways of organizing production, even maybe, yeah, which we need to maybe open up. After all, for me, the law is exciting precisely because you're sort of like a musician sometimes with law. You have to you have a structure. And you can't just do any old thing. but you've got to sort of, try and communicate or set up something using, maybe bits and pieces from here and there. And that's the kind of thing that, I mean, I'm saying this all very, very fancily right now, but I concretely, I don't know, but I think that's where we've got to go with the gig economy. You can't, the Indian thing, I noted a little kind of a thing, and really very recently, the codes that the Indian government has set out now mentions the gig economy, and they demand and they say they're turning it into a what is it, a kind of a labor protection, social protection kind of a thing, and they now say that the employer should pay 1 to 2% of their turnover in a common pool of funds for gig workers, which will be basically be maintained by the government. So this is it's still I don't know if it's fully on the anvil. I mean, it's fully there, but it's on the anvil. So here is an attempt then to deal with it as a social security issue, but I don't know if that. At least I can't commit on whether I think it's good or bad. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to Rashmi, who will do the conclusion remarks for us, I would like to read Daniel's comment to Ghazal's previous question and Professor Botha's response. Daniel says that we are seeing the corporation take the role of nation states to a certain degree as well. If we look at healthcare in the US, that's almost entirely employer provided, and your health is tied to your job's performance. So I just wanted to read Daniel's response, since he was kind enough to participate in written to our webinar. So I give the floor to Rashmi to do the conclusion remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists. I just have one little thing to add, just taking off from what Professor Singh said, that we need to really expand our disciplinary imagination to bring in all sorts of things we haven't envisaged before, which come from the digitalization of development and so on and so forth. And I would just like to say that labor law and labor regulations in Indian law schools are just almost completely marginalized as subjects. And I think that has really restricted my own disciplinary imagination with regard to just coming up with legal solutions about labor issues. And I don't know, just throughout at least my own law school journey, labor law was not cool, and that actually has made a huge difference. Today, this panel actually just to give names to my intuitions about labor law, because in my formal training, I found it quite inadequate. So thank you to both panelists for this extremely thought-provoking conversation and taking the time to share your expertise with us. And we really hope that we get to collaborate with you again, if ever, in the future. And thank you also to the participants for your insightful questions, Omkar, Daniel, Bruno, of course. And I can see that this conversation hasn't really led to a neat and tidy conclusion, and that we've been left with more questions than answers. But as long as we have come away with different questions, newer questions than what we started out with, if that has happened for the attendees, then I think we've achieved what we started out with. Last thing, the last webinar in our series is going to take place on the 9th of December at the same time, and its theme is going to be environmental law. So we hope to see all of you with us again on 9th of December. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you also to Ghazal, Bruno, and Eirni for this really great team effort that we're putting in. And I'm really glad to be a part of it. I was actually recently recruited, so yeah, super happy to be part of it.
Yeah. Please, can I just some quick thing. Do put me on your list when you have things so that I can
Thank
join
you.
in if I
Sure.
can. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you
Thank
to
you so much.
everyone.
Thanks,
Have a
everyone.
lovely day.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.